All right, everybody, it's that time of year where we welcome on our resident bracketologist. You know him from making tacos and so many other DA show drops throughout the years that he used on Winthrop radio broadcasts. He's now one of the broadcasters for the Southern Conference, and the SoCon knows its mid-majors and low majors, and so does our guest who's going to break it all down for us. We go through the brackets with our friend Dave Friedman, a.k.a. Super Dave. Dave, what's going on, buddy?
Best time of year, DA. Hope you're doing well.
You too, my man. So let's go through some different categories, okay? We're going to organize this and stack this for the casual basketball fans as they're kind of looking at the field of 68. They know exactly what we're honing in on. So let's start at the bigs, with the bigs, and maybe the top seeds were around there. Who, in your estimation, is the best high major coach in the country in the tournament?
Well, I mean, anyone that's watched college basketball for the last 30 years would have a hard time arguing for someone other than Rick Pitino. I mean, he is a savant and a genius, and everywhere he's gone, they've succeeded, and his second year is always better than his first year, and he's taken a team that can't shoot and turned them into one of the best teams in the country, which is sort of incredible. I actually think St. John's is overseeded, but boy, if there's one guy you want on the bench with 4 minutes to go or game planning for a second game in 3 days, I'm not sure you can do better than Rick Pitino.
Disgraced from Louisville, and at that point in time, he's in his 60s.
Was he disgraced?
and you could easily at that point go, all right, I've done it. I've won national championships. The only jobs I'm getting are bad jobs. I'm going to retire. And instead, Pitino goes to Greece for 2 years because nobody even in college basketball will touch him. Then comes back and takes Iona, which again, imagine being a Hall of Fame head coach and the best job you can get is Iona. Then parlays that into St. John's. And for 25 to 30 years, St. John's hasn't been able to have much success. The fact is, I've come to this conclusion. Our alma mater, Syracuse at Jim Boeheim, Coach K at Duke, Roy Williams at UNC, Jay Wright at Villanova, all Hall of Fame guys. But at some point, they just stopped caring. They're like, it's too much labor now to keep doing it. And Rick Pitino stared labor and difficulty in the face and said, F yourself, I'll go to Greece and then Iona to keep coaching. This guy is a psychotic.
Yeah, he's also brilliant at what he does. And all of the guys you mentioned previously are Hall of Fame coaches. And if we sat them down in a room and we said, hey, just informal poll, who's the best basketball coach? It might be unanimous. I mean, what Rick Pitino does, X's and O's, what he does in game, he's brilliant. He's incredible. I mean, Boston University, Providence, Kentucky, Louisville, Iona, St. John's, Greece. I mean, these are programs that got worse when he left and better when he arrived, and he's ridiculous. Now, that being said, if you look at like the net or the Ken Palm, things like that, like St. John's should be like a 3, maybe a 4 seed, and instead they're a 2 seed. The Big East wasn't very good this year, but you have to respect Rick Pitino.
Let's go from best high major coach to worst coach in the tournament. Who do you think is the worst coach that's in the field of 68?
Yeah, that's really tough. I mean, I think you got to look at some of the people that are highly resourced and didn't have the years maybe you would expect. I mean, John Calipari comes to mind, right? I mean, you figured with all the NIL and all of the resume that they were going to be better than a 10 seed, right? I mean, John Calipari has put together an unbelievable career, but I don't think people would say he met expectations this year. You look at Hubert Davis at North Carolina. Again, the resources are going into the program. The history is there. They maybe shouldn't have even made the bracket, and they're in it. And like, I think there's reason to believe that San Diego State is going to take them out of the tournament before half the people have filled out their brackets. But you know, that's the nature of the business. Not everyone gets to be a top 5 seed. Bruce Pearl coached one of the worst NCAA tournament games I've ever seen a couple of years ago. I thought it was an embarrassment, and it stayed with me for like 6 or 12 months. And they're a number 1 seed, and now they look great. So, you know, it's a moving scale to a degree.
Are you as outraged as others that UNC got in 1-11 in quad one games?
I don't know if I'm outraged because we're talking about the back of the bracket. What doesn't make sense to me is Louisville, who is clearly one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the ACC, getting an 8 seed, yet North Carolina still gets in on the bubble. If you thought that the ACC was pretty good or decent or solid, then Louisville's metrics suggest they should be a 4, 5, 6. If you thought the ACC was dreadful and Louisville is legitimately an 8, then how does North Carolina get in? And I know the committee will tell you it's not about leagues, it's about teams, but then tell me how the SEC has 14 teams in.
Exactly. You have 2 schools out of the SEC, Oklahoma and Texas, that went 6-12 in conference. Now, I don't know how many at-larges ever go to a team that's 6 games under 500 in league. But clearly they said it doesn't really matter because the SEC is so awesome. And yet the flip side was the ACC was trash this year, and they gave UNC an at-large bid. You might not be outraged, and maybe there shouldn't be outrage because, as you said, we're talking about the number 68 and 69 teams in America. But still, it seemed ridiculous that they rewarded UNC.
The smell test, right? We watched the games. They didn't look like a good basketball team almost the entire year. They did play a very strong non-conference schedule. Unfortunately, they lost a lot of those games. Is that what we want to reward to go to the dance? A team that played good teams but didn't beat them.
That's right. Okay, so now let's get into your wheelhouse, the mid-majors, the low majors. You know these guys as well as anybody. You spent, 17 seasons at Winthrop, and so now you're in the SoCon as a conference as a whole, so you're seeing all these guys come through. Who was the best mid-major coach in the field?
Well, I mean, this is our annual segment, right? And I talk about Randy Bennett in this piece of our video or audio or however we've done this for the last decade. You know how I feel about Randy Bennett. Non-COVID seasons, he's had 18 straight 20-win years, and of those 18 years, 14 of them have been 25-win seasons. Number 1 in the country rebound margin, great on the offensive glass, great defensively. I've said it for years. I think St. Mary's is the best program in the country. Last 5 seconds of the shot clock, unbelievably patient. They know what they're doing at all times. And Augustus Marshallonis, Sharunis's son, is their star player and the player of the year in the WCC. I thought they were a Sweet 16 team before the year started. There's just not anything that has suggested to me that's not the case during the course of the year. Is Alabama a potential very, very difficult second-round opponent? Yeah, that would be quite a contrast in styles, though. St. Mary's elite defensively. Alabama might be the best offensive team in the country, but there are long stretches where they don't play defense.
St. Mary's is a 7 seed. They'll open up against Vandy in a 7-10 matchup on Friday. Where do you stand on Will Wade? I mean, Will Wade was at LSU. Speaking of disgraced, has to leave, takes over McNeese. They're in the tournament back-to-back years. They've been dominant in that conference. Where are we on Wade?
Couldn't be higher on Wade. One of the best coaches in the United States of America. And again, the stuff that took place, if you want to knock at a morals cause, that sort of thing, totally fine. People that know Will Wade love him. His fellow coaches love him. Everyone respects him from an X's and O's standpoint. And when you consider we're in the NIL era, McNeese has a ton of NIL. They've got really, really good players. I'm incredibly interested to see where Will Wade is coaching next year. You mentioned a bunch of schools earlier, Syracuse included, that could be, should be, might be looking for coaches in the future. Villanova's got a coaching job open now. Virginia's got a coaching job open. NC State's got a coaching job open. I mean, if Will Wade isn't the first person on your list, you're not paying attention. Although Jim Crutchfield at Nova Southeastern has deserved an opportunity for well over a decade.
Now, McNeese is a 5-12 matchup. They'll take on Clemson in the first round. Let me ask you about a mid-major player, okay? Give me a player that maybe most of America hasn't watched this season that you think can have a dynamic tournament.
Well, I think Bennett Sturtz at Drake is someone that everyone's gonna notice, particularly if they beat Missouri, if they go on some sort of run. But the story at Drake for head coach Ben McCollum is remarkable. He won Division II national championships at Northwest Missouri State, and he wouldn't leave, and he stayed, and he wouldn't interview well. The team went on a run, so he never got a job, and he wasn't really looking for a job. He's kind of a coach's coach, an X's and O's guy. So finally, he takes the job at Drake, and essentially he takes his entire Division II team, and they go 30-4 this year or whatever it is. And Sturtz, 6'4" point guard, 19 points a game, 4.5 rebounds a game, 6 assists a game. He's number 1 in the country in minutes played. He doesn't leave the court. He's dynamic for a team that is just outstanding. And Ben McCollum's another guy. He could be at a high major next year too.
Drake is an 11 seed. They're going to take on Mizzou in the 6-11 matchup with their first round game. Let's go now to another part of the mid-majors, okay? And as we talk about these teams, again, a lot of America hasn't watched much of them. But how about a sleeper team? This is a mid-major. Maybe it's a high-major team that's under the radar, but a sleeper team that you think can go into the tournament and win some games and get some notoriety.
Well, I think I texted you in early January that UC San Diego was going to win a tournament game and maybe more than one. I've watched them 5 times from start to finish, 40 minutes of UC San Diego on 5 occasions. I just think they're remarkable. This was a program that was not D1 fully eligible until this year. They were a very good D2 school, but they weren't even in D2 until like 20 years ago. And they are top 25 in offensive and defensive efficiency. I think the Big West was better this year than since any year since UNLV was in it in the Tarkanian era years and years and years ago. The team that they beat twice, including in the championship game, UC Irvine, you could talk about them with North Carolina and with Texas and with Xavier as like a legitimate, maybe they should have been in. They didn't have that big marquee out-of-conference win. Well, UC San Diego did. They went to Logan, Utah, where no one's won for 25 years, and they won a true road game, a bye game at a pretty good Utah State team. Eric Olin has done a terrific job. And the way they play, they can play 5 out with 5 guys that can shoot 3 simultaneously, but they also can really muck it up and defend and rebound. I think they're incredibly dangerous. And quite frankly, I think they got a great matchup against Michigan. I think the Big Ten is way, way overrated. I don't think it was a very good year. And teams that had to play this most recent Sunday are teams I largely like to try to bet against in March. So I think things have set up very nicely for the Tritons.
Okay, Michigan played on Sunday in the Big Ten title game. They'll play on Thursday, although the last game of the night on Thursday in the 5-12 matchup against UC San Diego. That's final game of the night on Thursday. Let's talk about most overrated team. Who's in the field that got overseeded, is getting overhyped?
I don't like Michigan State that much. Tom Izzo is an absolute genius, one of the greatest to ever do it. And I understand that since Jason Richardson's son has moved into the starting lineup, they've been dramatically better. But I just don't look at them as a 2 seed. I don't think anyone in the Big Ten should be a 2 seed. I know some people that like Maryland. I don't think their non-conference resume suggests anything brilliant. I've always liked Illinois a little bit, but I think they're correct as a 5-6 sort of team. I think Michigan State beat up on kind of a ho-hum, so-so conference. They weren't the dominant team. They might have been the best team, but they weren't a dominant team. I think Michigan State is much more like a 3-4 than a 2. And that's why I think Auburn kind of hit the jackpot. I think that bracket is so far and away the easiest one to navigate. I just think Auburn's better than the teams in that bracket. Now, I would have picked Iowa State. I'm really high on the Big 12. But when you take out either their best or their second best player, I don't know that anyone is deep enough in the bracket to say, yeah, we don't have our top dog and we're still going to beat a number one seed or go to the Final Four or what have you.
Any problem with Auburn being the number one overall seed after losing 3 of their Final Four?
I mean, if you believe the SEC was the best conference, and I think most people do, in the deepest conference, that they were the best team in that conference most of the year. Now, if you had talked to me 2 weeks ago, I told a couple of people I thought Florida was going to win the national championship because I love Todd Golden. He's Mr. Analytics. He's kind of every sensibility I have. They've built a team in exactly the way you want to like fill individual roles. But now the hype train is out of control, having won the SEC tournament. I don't think that's actually a positive. I don't like playing all of those extra high-stress games immediately before the NCAA tournament. So, I mean, if you look at their entire work from the beginning of November until the end of February or early March, I don't have an issue with Auburn. If you think Florida's the better team right now and more deserving to be number one, yeah, I could live with that too. I will tell you this, though. I think Florida's draw is much more difficult than Auburn. I think Texas Tech is very, very viable. If you look at my bracket, and it's at least in part because who wants to pick only 1 and 2 seeds? I've got Texas Tech in the Final Four.
Ooh, okay. That's interesting. So we'll get more into that here in a little bit. We just did who was overseeded. Who do you think got screwed with their draw or their seeding?
Well, I understand that Louisville didn't play an amazing schedule, and particularly in conference, they kind of avoided some of the big boys. But I don't know how a team that goes to the ACC title game and finishes top 3 in the league is an 8 seed. And if you watch the selection show, when their announcement was made, you could see the players celebrating and Pat Kelsey mouthing, an 8 seed? Like, are you kidding me? So like, maybe it will be proven out that the ACC was dreadful this year. If that's the case, though, doesn't Duke end up looking like the Gonzaga team that we talk about every year? Like, if the ACC is horrible and Duke is one of the top seeds in the tournament, like, that's sort of an interesting dynamic going on. So I think Louisville was probably underseeded. That one definitely stands out to me. Gonzaga, maybe too. I mean, you know how I feel about St. Mary's. This probably wasn't Mark Few's best team at Gonzaga, but they feel like better than an 8 to me. I mean, if Gonzaga was playing Clemson or Purdue in their same bracket, I think a lot of people would be picking Gonzaga, and that's against 4 and 5 seeds.
So speaking of the 5s, there's always a 5-12 we like to circle that somebody thinks is going to be the 5-12 upset. Who do you got, if you got any of the 5-12 upsets?
Well, I love UC San Diego. I mean, that's the clear one to me. But I'm interested in McNeese too. We talked about Will Wade. I think he's brilliant at what he does. I think he's got a really good roster. And Clemson is the type of team that, like, I could see it either way. If you told me Clemson was in the Sweet 16 or the Elite 8, wouldn't surprise me at all. If you told me that McNeese went in and punked him and was just better, that wouldn't shock me either.
Okay, so we already have one of your Final Four teams. What's the rest of Super Dave's Final Four look like?
Well, again, part of this is game theory, right? I don't want to pick Florida because so many people are picking Florida. I think they're really good. Can they go to the Final Four? Yes. Can they win the national title? Of course. But like I said, I picked Texas Tech out of that bracket. I want to pick a team who I think is one of the 2 or 3 or 4 best teams in the country to win the national title, but I don't want it to be the team that everybody is picking. And that's how I arrived very clearly at Houston. They do all of the things that I love. They rebound and they defend. I think maybe they're a pinch underrated. They played the conference tournament without one of their key starters who's going to be back, I think, for the tournament. And they've moved up in leagues and the results have continued to be exactly the same. Now, do they play that kind of small margin of error basketball, those close games, those games Virginia used to play that you can easily lose early on? Yeah, they do. Can they lose to Gonzaga? Maybe one of the more difficult 1 versus 8 or 9 games to get to the Sweet 16? Yeah, they do. But if they beat a Gonzaga, or if Georgia beats Gonzaga, if they beat Georgia, I think the second pod in that bracket is really, really weak. Purdue and Clemson aren't teams I like. And while McNeese and High Point are capable, I don't think they're going to the Elite Eight. So Houston essentially has one game to get to a regional final. Then they would get a Kentucky or a Tennessee. I really like Houston a lot. The team in the East that I think is really interesting is BYU. I don't love a potential Sweet 16 matchup with Alabama because they're basically the same teams. They both just want to outscore you. I think BYU's really, really talented, though, and I think they can give Alabama a big-time game. I picked Duke out of the East more just because I think their 8 teams at the top are much weaker than the 8 teams at the bottom. I like BYU, but I picked Duke to beat them or to beat Alabama to get there. And I picked Auburn just because I think it's a really weak bracket.
Okay. So we got Duke, Auburn, Texas Tech, and who am I forgetting?
Houston.
And Houston into the Final Four. Let me ask you about big picture selection Sunday type of thing here. We have Pitino as a 2 seed, and if St. John's wins over Omaha, they get a second round matchup against either Kansas and Bill Self or Coach Calipari and Arkansas. Are we to believe, do you believe, that they don't take that stuff into account, that it just so happens a potential Pitino-Cal matchup in prime time over the weekend just happens because that's the line that those schools end on? Or are they orchestrating this stuff?
Well, I think it's somewhere in between. I don't think they're looking for these amazing stories and saying, let's bracket to make sure we have Rick Pitino versus Cal. But I don't think they're going, we can't possibly have that. Let's not do that. So, yeah, I mean, if we're being honest, the idea of the selection committee is ridiculous. Like, we should have analytics for this like they do for hockey, and it should just be very clear cut. The teams with the best data advance, and the teams that don't. Like that's how it should be done. When you put human beings into it, human beings are going to think like people. There's going to be this kind of silly eye test that goes on, but like, are you really watching Drake as carefully as you're watching North Carolina? Are you really watching UC Irvine the same way you're watching Texas? Like, and eyes can very easily betray you. Like, there's little reason this shouldn't be done using data. Once we take data and don't use it entirely, we put people in, and people are going to go, geez, Rick Pitino and John Calipari, that would make for a wonderful television show. And indeed it will.
Before we let you go, was there any opportunity this year in the Southern Conference to use Making Tacos, Weird Waste, Have Fun With Your Marriage?
Was there an opportunity? Perhaps there was an opportunity missed, but okay. That's why there's always next season, DA. I also should throw out Wofford from the Southern Conference is playing Tennessee, and Tennessee is really, really good. Wofford is a rather interesting story. They're the MVP of the Southern Conference tournament, Kyler Filowich, a big guy from Manitoba. Don't see a lot of guys from Canada, kind of the MVP of a conference tournament. He really, really struggles at the free throw line. And during the season, he went to the coaches and said, I'm really afraid I may lose a big game and we need to do something. And they brought in Rick Barry, and he now shoots underhanded free throws. And that's kind of neat and kind of cool. They were the 6th seed in the SoCon tournament. So if you love the little guy in this bracket, you should have loved them in last week's bracket too.
Wofford. Okay, the Wofford Terriers. Keep an eye on them, as according to Super Dave. Well, Super Dave has been a long time part of the DA show and has a lot of fans out there, especially with all of his slogans and catchphrases and drops that he's woven into his play-by-play before. Longtime voice of the Winthrop Eagles, now a broadcaster for the Southern Conference, joining us here on the show. Super Dave, we root for your best bracket, not to throw it out immediately. And we always like when you don't just go chalk because everybody else does. You try to find something under the radar.
No question, DA. It's the best time of year. I'll be chucking my bracket midday Thursday, just like everyone else. That's what makes it the best. And happy 1 year anniversary.
Yeah, thank you. Watch DA Live has hit 1 year here on the YouTube channel, our live show on Sunday nights. So if you're watching this as a whole, make sure you check out our 1 year anniversary show coming up here on this YouTube channel. All right, Super Dave, talk to you later, man.
Yep, take care.